Caitlin, I want to know, what was the first steamy scene you ever saw in a movie?
You mean besides all the scenes with the Beast in Beauty and the Beast?
Yeah, way too much hair.
Fair enough. It was probably Titanic at age 13, and I definitely saw it 3 times in the movie theater.
Ah, yes. The sweaty hand in the car.
Mm-hmm.
And then they died.
So kids, that's why you don't sketch each other's bosoms.
From Religion News Service, this is Saved by the City, a podcast from 2 single Christian women trying to date without getting skeeved out. I'm Roxy Stone.
And I'm Katelyn Beatty.
We've talked a lot, both on and off the podcast, about purity culture, sometimes with a few drinks.
We've definitely critiqued the way that purity culture treated our bodies, female sexuality, and our futures.
But here's the thing. After purity culture, we're not really sure what a better alternative is.
Mainstream sexual ethics, it seems, can be confusing, lacking a script, and quickly changing.
Something we've encountered more than a few times when we log on to the dating websites.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Today, we're super pumped to hear from Christine Emba, one of our guests from season 1, about why so many of our peers, especially perhaps fellow women, aren't really happy with modern bedroom behavior.
But first, let's go back to those movies and TV shows, because if you're like me, that's actually where you learned a lot about sex, because they weren't teaching it in school much, certainly not at church. So I think I got a lot of my ideas about sex from the movies.
Definitely, outside of whatever I heard at youth group about how bad it was, I was getting a lot of other messages. So now it's time to present you with
the 6 rules of sexy cinema.
Ooh. Okay, rule number 1. Sex is for people who are incredibly attractive.
Mm-hmm.
And for women, thin, young, and almost always white.
Pretty Woman comes to mind.
Every James Bond movie ever made.
Dirty Dancing.
Hot people have sex.
Mm-hmm. To hot music. Rule number 2. Sex between unhot, read normal people, is awkward but funny. It's always got to be funny.
Yes.
Like American Pie.
A big movie that was popular when I was in high school. I was not actually allowed to see it, but very much about normal teenagers with sexual urges doing very awkward and gross things.
Mm-hmm.
Also, all of Judd Apatow's movies are essentially like normal men.
The women are hot.
The women are almost always hot, but normal looking guys finding themselves in awkward situations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those scenes are never as steamy. They're always just kind of goofy.
Mm-hmm.
Silly.
Rule number 3. Sex between married people is boring. 1, I would say I couldn't think of a lot of movies where we see married couples having sex. Mm-hmm. And when they do, it's like bad or disconnected. And so one of the protagonists is like encouraged or propelled to find sexual excitement outside the marriage, which is where sex is exciting.
Yeah. It's usually set up as the foil. Like, it's so bad at home, I went and had this affair.
I mean, have you seen a movie or a TV show where married sex is like good?
Probably. But I'm not thinking of one. And it probably wasn't when I was a kid, because I feel like there's been more nuanced shows about marriages since I was a kid, because people recognize this problem, but I can't think of any.
Well, I think it's implied that Marge and Homer Simpson connected in the bedroom.
That they had steamy sex.
Steamy yellow cartoon sex.
All right. Rule number 4, not having sex is weird, as in virginity or abstinence. It's almost always painted as sort of weird, undesirable, foreign, strange, bizarre choice, or because you're not hot enough.
Or you're like a weirdly religious person. Which I feel like was always
Yes.
like came up in church culture. Like they were trying to make virginity cool again to counteract this idea that like, oh, virgins are dorks,
Yeah.
you know?
Right. But usually, like, at least in the movies, those ultra religious people not having sex were shown to be very like repressed.
Yeah, they had their own problems.
Yeah.
Rule number 5. How do I put this delicately? Even though we see, so in the movies, we see a lot of body, but the sex is very clean and smooth and not messy.
Absolutely. It's the mechanics of it are rarely shown. And it's, there's a lot of strategically placed like arms and pillows, and it all just goes very smoothly.
It's choreographed.
Yeah. Usually there's a mutual and simultaneous orgasm, and everyone is just really happy. And also hot music. I'm thinking Top Gun, that iconic song, You Take My Breath Away. It's like there's a lot shown and yet so much left to the imagination.
Right. Rule number 6. Finally, we had to have 6 because we had to have the alliteration of 6, sexy, and cinema.
Of course.
People don't talk after sex.
Nope, that's true.
Like, we usually don't see like, okay, but what happens after in the relationship? Do they have to communicate about things besides some guy being like, that was awesome?
Yeah, there's nobody's like, I'm going to go to the bathroom and brush my teeth. There's never like, you're pulling the covers off. That's my side of the bed to sleep on. Like, there's never any of that. And there's no debrief.
There's no debrief and there's no rebrief. Get it?
We get an initial debrief, but then no debrief. The pants come off, but they don't go back on.
Okay, so now that we've covered the 6 rules of sexy cinema, it's probably the case that the movies weren't altogether helpful in helping us really understand what human sexuality is like.
It turns out they were fictional in more than one way.
True that. So, if not purity culture, and if not sex according to the movies, what is the story about sex that we find the most compelling?
I find myself asking that question a lot at this time in my life. So I'm glad that we're doing a podcast about it.
And you're not nervous at all?
Very.
Well, we won't be alone. We will be joined by Christine Emba.
Christine is a columnist for The Washington Post, and she's the author of the new book, Rethinking Sex, A Provocation.
I think there's sort of pluses and minuses. I think purity culture actually did teach something meaningful and important, which is that sex is meaningful and important and is not just like two people high-fiving each other, but with their genitals.
Our conversation with Christine is coming up just after the break.
Religion News Service is an independent, award-winning source of global reporting on religion, spirituality, culture, and ethics.
Get the dope on the Pope.
And if you like what we're doing at Saved by the City, let us know. Throw us a rating or review. It goes a long way toward helping get the word out about the show.
You can also email us whenever you want at sbtcpodcast@religionnews.com. We'd love to hear from you, and we will reply. Today's guest, our first repeat guest, besides our moms, Karen and Sharon, and Ben DeHart, a.k.a. Hot Priest, is Christine Emba.
Hey, Christine. Welcome back.
Hey, Christine.
Hi. Thanks for having me back on. So exciting to be here.
So one of the things you note early on in your book is that we're in this time of contradiction where we're seeing sex and talking about sex more than ever, and yet fewer and fewer people are actually having sex. What has caused the so-called sex recession?
Yeah, that's a great question and an interesting phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem is that we don't totally know. There are a lot of different theories for why this is happening. Obviously, the pandemic did not help over the past 2 years.
Sure.
Wasn't a sexy time.
It wasn't a sexy time. But I mean, it contributed to, loneliness, to finding it harder to meet other people, fewer acquaintances. But then there are also theories that it has to do with distractions, more time spent streaming TV and on social media. And then also just sort of fear, whether it's fear of bad behavior. So the sex researcher Debbie Herbnick has theorized that there's much more discussion among young people of like being startled by sexual acts that happen in their encounters, and then maybe perhaps being shy of having sex because, they don't know what's going to happen to them. And, a sort of sense of, amidst all of this supposed sexual freedom that we have, just not knowing how to act, not knowing what exactly you should be doing to get into a relationship and stay in one. Because it is in relationships where people actually tend to have sex.
Right. I mean, I think there's a narrative out there that like young, single, free people who are having sex with maybe multiple partners are having a lot more sex. But the reality is that people in committed relationships, generally speaking, have more sex than those who are not in committed relationships.
Accurate, yes.
In part, it feels a little bit like there's a lot of confusion about what you're supposed to want, what this relationship is, what that relationship is, and what it isn't. And in some ways difficult to communicate those things because maybe everybody's either making up assumptions or coming at relationships without really a lot of clarity about what they want or what they want from the other person.
Yeah, I think that seems right. I mean, I feel like one of the things that came up again and again in the conversations with women that I had for the book was that they feel like they should be asking for one thing, but what they really want is something different. Like they maybe actually want a relationship. They want to have one partner, not to be constantly experimenting with many.
Let's talk about open relationships.
Let's.
If you are on the dating apps and you're seeking either a date or a partner, whatever you're seeking, you're going to come across people who have in their profile either ethically non-monogamous or in an open relationship, but we're open to exploring things outside the relationship. This is going to be a personal question, but here we are. Would you ever date someone who is also in a relationship with somebody else or multiple other people?
I personally would not, because I think of relationships as a space for commitment between two people, I suppose. And like, that's what I'm looking for. I've also noticed the profusion, and it's often sort of stuck at the end of someone's profile. And like,
oh, by the way,
you've gotten this far.
Yeah, with ENM or something, like just the initial so that you almost skip over it, and then you're like, oh, wait, hang on. But again, so many of the women and even men I talk to in interviews for this book, like I see this all the time and I'm not into it, but I feel like I should be. Every week there's an article in the New York Times about how polyamory is sort of the next level of sex that we should all aspire to.
And I've heard, heard a lot of like arguments that this is really the next step of liberation out of patriarchy, that a big part of, the patriarchal hierarchy has been set up with one man kind of owns a woman, and that this is the next step for women of getting out of that.
Well, I think one of the things that our culture idealizes, in sort of a liberal, not in the political sense, but sort of liberal, democratic, and capitalist society, is the idea of freedom, of having options and being able to keep your options sort of open. And committed relationships and marriage are kind of by definition the closing off of options, right? You choose to be with one person, you're in one relationship. And so if you hold the idea of freedom as kind of the greatest good, then of course you're thinking like, how can I make these closed relationships freer? Like, how can I continue to give myself options to meet other people, options to sleep with someone else? And in that sense, I guess polyamory is the next step in that direction. But there's also something to be said for commitment and for dependency and, building one thing with another person that lasts for a long time. And it sometimes feels like we're being pushed to trade that for some nebulous idea of freedom that doesn't actually serve us in the long run.
I wonder if this is just me psychologizing all of my 29-year-old peers in Brooklyn. But when I think back to my 20s, the opportunity to date lots of people and to have those experiences was fun and exciting. But I do wonder if some of this is like getting old and thinking about like what you really want at the end of the day. I don't think that polyamory is as like widespread as maybe the New York Times think pieces make it out to be.
That seems right to me too. And also I think that COVID, right, that the pandemic has maybe pushed people to think about these questions a little bit more too. Mm-hmm. Like it's one thing to be exploring your options when you're able to sort of like run around Brooklyn and meet as many people as you want. But then when you're stuck in your house for 2 years thinking about like your impending mortality, I think a lot of people have come out of that being like, whoa, what do I actually want in real life now? And how do I get that? So maybe it's a moment of hope.
One thing you talk about, you observe, is that there's been, in a lot of ways, heightened since the Me Too movement, this conversation about consent, and that is like the core fundamental rule of our modern sexual ethic is as long as there's consent, like it's okay. But you say that's not enough. And what else do you think? Why and what else do we need?
Yeah, so I think one of the core messages in Rethinking Sex is exactly that consent is a totally necessary baseline. Like you have to have consent before you have sex with someone. But consent is a floor. It's not a ceiling. And I think if you ask anyone reasonable, they will say that they want more from sex than being able to say, I did not commit a felony against this person. Like that's a really low bar. And I think we all want more than that. We need to be able to hold ourselves to a higher standard. We want to know how to care for someone, how to not just have sex with someone without criminally assaulting them, but also how to have sex ethically and morally in a broader sense, how to treat people well and with the human dignity that they deserve. Consent is like a really good sort of legal barrier to keep you out of the most serious trouble, but it doesn't take us anywhere close to where we need to go, and also leaves so many things out of the equation that we still need to think about.
In your book, you talk to a lot of women who say, I didn't say no. I said yes to this thing that, looking back, I don't know that I actually wanted. And I didn't know how to communicate that. And why did I feel a kind of pressure or social script to go along with something that I didn't actually want?
Right, absolutely. I think that this is one of the things that consent leaves out, that we also need to ask ourselves. Not just did this person say yes, but did they actually mean it? Did they say yes for the right reasons? Am I thinking about what is good for them and what they want and not just what I'm getting out of it? And then how does the sex that I'm having, how do the things that we're agreeing to or that I'm asking someone to agree to, what ramifications do they have on me morally, on them ethically, on society at large? Like what kind of world are we creating by engaging in things in certain ways? So again, it's about bigger things than just, is it a yes or is it a no? Sex happens between two people, but often the effects radiate outwards, and they also affect people for much longer than, the specific moment in which it's happening.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me that this is why purity culture wanted to make it very black and white, is that so that you don't get in a situation where, like, you don't know if somebody said yes for the right reasons. You don't know if you said yes for the right reasons. You don't know if you said yes because of a social script, as Katelyn said, or because, you're 17 and you really want this person to like you. And, and so in some ways, purity culture was like some guardrails around that and just like, let's make it very black and white. But we've also been working to dismantle purity culture. So in what ways do you think was purity culture onto something in helping people have those guardrails? In what ways does sex have like these spiritual consequences that require more than just black and white, yes, no kind of things?
Yeah, so I think we talked about this a little bit the last time I was on the show too, but I think there's sort of pluses and minuses. I think purity culture actually did teach something meaningful and important, which is that sex is meaningful and important and is not just like two people high-fiving each other, but with their genitals.
Ouch!
But that it actually, yeah, that doesn't even sound pleasant,
No.
right? But that it actually affects people, both physically and spiritually. I think one of the things that purity culture kind of failed us on in some ways was not giving us more context than that, and not really talking to us that much about, what a relationship should look like. How do we really love each other in certain ways? And also just what is sex? Like, how do we understand it? It's one thing to be like, no, don't do this. It's another thing to be like, this is what this is. Let me explain what's meaningful around it in a specific way so that you understand it and make it clear what's going on. I think purity culture, as preached by some and not all churches, was a lot of don't do the thing.
Yeah.
But then
Which
you don't get that much context on like why not?
Right.
What even is the thing? How should I think about this as apart from something that's forbidden?
You've got this book coming out, and so you're going to have to do tons of interviews about sex. So I really kind of want to just know like why you wrote it. Like what made you think like this is what I want to commit a year and a half or 2 years of writing and then a bunch of time doing interviews on like why put yourself through that? Why was this topic so important to you to write on right now?
Okay, that's a great question, and one that I've been asking myself actually. Honestly, I feel like that's how editors get these first-time writers. Like anybody who'd ever written a book before would not be like, "Oh yeah, I'm gonna fix sex. That's my project. Seems chill and cool." Like, no, they would be too smart to do that. But I'd never written a book before, and so I was like, "Oh, this was like an interesting academic project." Post Me Too, like there's so much conversation happening. I'll just dive right in. And only later on was I like, wow, in writing this book, I have to think about how I think about sex, think about my own past experiences, like really rethink sex, not just as an academic concern philosophically, but also in my own life. And my editor, when I have complained about this a little bit, have pointed out that like this like became more personal and more intense than I might have imagined at first. She was like, I think that authors write the book they need to read. And I think in the Me Too moment in, 2017, 2018, there was so much conversation around, we can say that Harvey Weinstein is a bad guy. He didn't get consent. Like there were these obvious cases, right? But then there was all this conversation happening around Cat Person and Aziza Ansari and, these not non-consensual, but still really bad experiences that people were having. And then even among my friends and the women I knew, there was this undercurrent of, we're liberated, but we're kind of miserable. And rethinking sex, I think, was my attempt to just sort of unpack that, try and figure out what was going on in our sexual culture that made things feel so off for people. And how do we move the conversation to a place where we're talking about what could fix it? Not just the obvious, don't be like Matt Lauer, but how should we live in our everyday lives? How do we treat each other? What does sex really mean to us and, as a thing in itself? How do we talk about that? I think I wanted the words for it, but I also wanted rethinking sex to hopefully move the conversation forward a little bit and leave some room for people to critique, sort of uncritical sex positivity and the fantasies of what liberation looks like and what sex should look like.
Maybe as a final question, how have you responded or plan to respond to readers who say that your approach to sex and some of the holes that you're poking in the dominant sexual narrative is sex negative, that you're not being sex positive in some of your critiques?
So I talk a lot about the history of the feminist movement and the sexual revolution in Rethinking Sex. And so to those people, I think I would say that they might have the wrong understanding of what sex positivity originally meant. The whole point of kind of the feminist revolution and even the sexual revolution was to show that women were important and their needs and desires were as important as those of men. And in the modern day, it almost seems like we've kind of moved towards not just women are important, but women should be like the worst kind of man. Like to succeed sexually, what that actually looks like is, not women's liberation, but having a play girl to go along with play boy. And so I would ask them, what they think is sex positive about the culture right now, and also why we shouldn't be able to unpack some of the assumptions that we have. There's such a thing as, uncritical sex positivity where, you're just like sex, it's good. But that doesn't leave any room for people to complain, people to critique the norms, people to almost create that culture for themselves instead of just taking what's fed to them.
That's great.
Boom.
Yes. Well, thank you for writing the book that you needed to read and that we needed to read. And hopefully lots of other people who need to read it will read it as well.
Yes. Thank you, Christine.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thanks for having me.
Okay. So, Roxy, what is the weirdest thing you would say you've ever dealt with on a date in this realm of human sexuality?
Actually, I feel like this isn't weird. This is actually the normal, which I think is weird, which is that a lot, and I mean the majority of first dates I've gone on that have been on the apps, the guy has gone in for a kiss at the end.
Right.
That's just wild to me that like there's an expectation there for a first kiss on a first date of a person you have never met before. And I don't know when that became the norm.
Well, I'm kind of surprised that that's your answer because in some ways that feels more respectful than what I might have expected, like men being, pressuring or inviting themselves over to your apartment or like immediately turning things more sexual. But I think to your point, it is the idea that like you're initiating physical contact with someone you've known for like 2 hours and who could be not a great person.
Yeah. And like the reality is that a lot of those guys I haven't heard from again or haven't talked to again. I have also not reached out. And it creates, as Christine was talking about, I think this is what made me think of it, is that it creates this moment where you have to decide whether you consent or not really quickly with someone you don't know very well and you don't know how they're going to take it. And, I have both just gone ahead and kissed someone that I wasn't really all that keen to kiss just to not have an awkward conversation or like have to make the move away, and then say why. And then I've also like said I don't want to and felt really weird. And it was a weird conversation to have.
I have a follow-up question. On average, do these gentlemen ask, can I kiss you goodnight? Or would you say in general, they just go in for it? Okay. And do you turn your cheek if you don't want it? Or do you say,
I've tried different things. Like I've taken a step back and said, I'm not comfortable doing that on a first date, but I really enjoyed our time together. Something like that. One time I said I thought I was getting a cold sore, which...
For some reason, the fact that I thought you were going to say I was getting a cold.
Oh, no, I remember cold sore, which is just like immediately turns people off.
Is like, yeah, because it's like oral and easally contagious, and like I basically have a germ I want to give you in my mouth.
Herpes of the mouth, and I was like, "Are you sure you want to?"
Exactly.
I was really not interested in that guy, so. It worked.
You're like, what's the worst communicable disease I could think of that he couldn't like prove? Well, yeah, it's effective.
Yeah. So I think it's just, and like I said, like honestly, the most recent date I went on, like it was, I just ended up kissing him, and I didn't really want to, but a lot of like what Christine said is like what I felt in the moment is like I just want to go home. We're like on a subway, like he'd walked me to the subway platform, and that felt weird, and the train was like literally coming, and it just was like I was just like, oh, okay.
The least sexy setting one could find in New York for a kiss.
And I have not texted him, and he has not texted me since. So
yeah, I mean, to your point, and something we talked about with Christine is it seems like many women do end up technically consenting to things and then later feeling like, is that actually what I wanted? Not having the tools or the framework in the moment to say, what do I actually want out of this encounter or this relationship with this person? Like, not just being so mindful of what he wants from the moment, because obviously if someone's going in to kiss you, you're very aware of like, he has this expectation that we are going to kiss, but having the internal resources to really step back and ask, what do I want out of this? It seems hard for a lot of women, I would imagine, in part because despite the advances of feminism, we are still culturally taught to be mindful of how other people feel and to be deferential to men, you know?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I mean, I know this about myself, and, you know, I don't think it's necessarily the healthiest impulse, but I am constantly like gauging how does the other person feel on this date more than I'm gauging how I'm feeling on these dates. Like, it's just, I don't know why that is. I usually get home and wonder, like, did that person have a good time? And I don't go, did I have a good time?
Wait, really?
Yeah.
Is that with your friends as well?
Yeah. I mean, when I got home, for example, from my recent birthday party, I was like, I hope everyone had a really good time. Like, oh, I worried about that, you know. And I think, you know, and I think most of the time, like when I get home from somebody's birthday party, I'm like, I hope the birthday person had a really good time at their birthday party.
So in none of these circumstances are you like, did I like that? How did I feel about that?
Not my immediate impulse. Yeah.
Yeah. So I really liked the metaphor. It's like a house metaphor that we were talking about. The consent is a floor, not a ceiling.
Yes. I think that's a really good way to think about it.
So if we're building this house, what else is in the house? Like, what else are we looking for besides consent?
What is in between the floor and the ceiling? I mean, I guess we should all be aiming for the ceiling, but I do think that this, again, not the floor and not the ceiling, but I mean, I think enjoyment is part of it, mutual enjoyment. I'm not going to stop there. I don't think that's enough either, but I think that that is part of it. And I do think that is really hard to gauge and much more subjective, but I think that's part of the difficulty of decorating this house, if you will, is that, you know, people's preferences are subjective. So it's difficult to say like what is enjoyment, but I think if you are not enjoying it, then it's not working. It's not good.
Yeah. Which feels so
basic.
On one hand, like so obvious to say, but then so many women would say, I went along. I basically went along to get along.
Yeah. And maybe like did it for different reasons than enjoyment. Like to keep a relationship going or to, you know, make the other person happy or to just not rock the boat or whatever.
I guess no one will be surprised that I'm going to sound like an old fuddy-duddy. I think that's been hinted at throughout this, except for the aforementioned bosoms. For me, commitment is, I just think it's something that I want. I think especially having had dating encounters or really romantic encounters where commitment was not on the table at all. And in some ways, I think I needed to. I needed to get that out of my system.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
You know, we've talked in season 1 about purity culture and having to kind of almost rebel against that in my late 20s after a series of romantic disappointments and feeling like God didn't uphold God's part of the bargain and I'm just going to do my own thing. And also, I'm like 29 and I just need to go off script for a little bit. So in some ways, developmentally, I think it was understandable for sure. And I think it was important in part to realize, okay, I see what else is out there. And I don't think it's actually what I want and coming to a place of choosing that rather than going along with, well, my parents and my pastor and my friends all said that I should do this, so that's what I'm going to do. But really internalizing a sense of what I want is to have, in the long run, like a romantic connection that is within the context of commitment. Does that make me sound like a fuddy-duddy?
I don't think so. I think the fact that, again, something that kind of seems fairly normal could make you sound like a fuddy-duddy or could make you sound strange or bizarre. Like, I think it wasn't until not that long ago that a statement like that might sound like, what? I think it's, I don't think it makes you sound like a fuddy-duddy, but I may not be the best person to ask.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like what we're talking about is intentionality and interrogating our own desires and then coming into situations, making decisions from that self-examination, which maybe is a long-winded, convoluted way of saying just having boundaries and keeping them.
Maybe it is. But also maybe I think setting the boundaries out of a place of, something that you truly value and not because society told you or your church told you or your parents told you or whatever, what those boundaries should be.
Yeah. And it's hard because the messages that we got around sex being inherently shameful, our bodies and desires being inherently shameful, like we got those at a really young age and those go really deep. And so it's hard to kind of rewrite those really deep narratives with adult narratives. But it seems to me that true sex positivity is about people being empowered to make choices in their sexual lives that are in accordance with every other part of their life and to have freedom from others' expectations. And so if that is the choice that really works the best for you, who's to say that's sex negative?
Absolutely. I think that's absolutely right. And I think it's so much more holistic to be able to say, to be able to connect with your emotions as well as the physicality of sex. And when it's not feeling good or when you think to yourself, I do want intimacy, like that, to have to repress those things, that also feels sex negative.
So it doesn't sound like we can think of any movies or TV shows that capture what we want.
Market opportunity.
In a romantic relationship, but in a future episode, maybe we'll come up with our own 6 rules of real sex, not 6 rules of sexy cinema.
Maybe we'll script our ideal sexy scene.
But if we've accomplished anything, it is that we are talking about sex. And that was something that Christine wants more of because of this book, that people are actually talking about their experiences and what they truly want. So mission kind of accomplished.
I'm looking for a sexy pun. I'm looking for a sexy joke here.
You mean missionary accomplished?
Let's put it to bed.
Saved by the City is a Religion News Service production. The producer is Jay Woodward and the consulting editor is Paul O'Donnell.
Chaz Rousseau put together our look and Martin Fowler wrote our theme music.
We are Katelyn Beatty
and Roxy Stone.
Thanks for listening.